Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and what I want to talk about today is my new library. I created a mini React library. It's not like a huge, crazy library. It's just it does something really simple. What it does is that it abstracts over use context and use reducer in React, and just makes it really easier to use those two hooks to create sort of a Redux-like workflow. So, I mean, technically, use context and use reduce already saved you the time of having to install Redux and do all the Redux boilerplate. This just saves you even more time, and this is a video to show you how to use this tool. It's called useDataStore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into my main folder. So I'm just going to close this terminal and open a new one. I'm going to just create a new React project. I'm going to use my create React basic template. Create React basic. Just clicker scaffolding, npx create React basic. We'll call this test data store. Okay, and that should end up making it. And then there it is, test data store. Okay, so I'm going to cd into that folder, cd test data store. I'm going to do an npm install to get all this installing, get all the dependencies installing. So that'll take a second, but a lot quicker than a create React app. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to install useDataStore. So npm I useDataStore. Cool. Okay, and that will do that. Good. Okay, so we're ready to go. So the first step is we need to create our data store. So I like to think the best way to do this is just do this in the whatever folder your app.js is in. So in this particular template, it's in the components folder, so that's where I'm going to do it. And I'll just create a file called ds.js. And essentially what we're going to do here is, now this is a little weird quirk, and this is the only step where you have this quirk, is that you need to import it using require, not import. For some reason, and this is something I will be looking into, so that way you don't have to worry about this for future versions of this, is that when you try to use import syntax, it doesn't import quite correctly versus if you use require. Require seems to pick it up. Okay, so here we go. So const, and then we're going to bring in the library. So that's the function is really going to be called create data store. That's what you import from the library. That's literally all the library is. It's one function called create data store that does all this stuff. Create data store equals require use data store. Okay, so now we have the function. So then what we need to do is define our initial state. Okay, so I'll create a variable initial state equals an object, and it'll just say count 0. Okay, then we need to define a reducer. Okay, now if you're not familiar with how reducers work, because you've never used like useReducer or Redux before, essentially the idea is this. It's a function that handles all your state logic for any kind of state-wide application data. So the idea is that instead of putting all the logic for house and state in your individual components, certain state will live in your data store, and you will call this dispatch function, and this dispatch function will pass in an action, and that action will determine how the new state gets created. So in this case, you would just basically create the logic in this one giant function, and then you'll be able to see all your sort of mutations to state in sort of one place. So for example, it looks something like this, like const reducer, and then that function gets passed in the original state, so it gets passed in the state as it is, and then it gets passed in the action, which is typically an object. Again, you can call it whatever you want. So then you have a function. A very typical pattern in doing a reducer is you use a switch. So what will happen is that we'll do a switch statement, and the switch will be, we're going to imagine that the action argument is going to be an object with a property called type. So action.type is passed, and again, you don't have to follow this pattern. This is just sort of the pattern that Redux typically uses. So instead of trying to introduce a new pattern, I'm trying to stick to what people are used to. Okay, action.type. So we'll say case add. Okay, and then in that case, if someone adds, what we're going to do is we're going to return. And the idea is that whatever the function the reducer returns, that's the new state. That's how these reducer functions work. Okay, so far we actually haven't gotten to using the library yet. It's just you need these two things to kick things off. So if we add, we're going to return, no, we don't, yeah, we return a new object that it has the existing state in it, plus count will equal state.count plus 1. And then since this is a switch, we always want to make sure that we do a break. Then I will copy that over, because we're just going to do one more. Okay. There we go, and this is going to be for subtracting, so sub. And then this will just do count minus 1. And then you always want to have a default in case for some reason someone forgets to write the action. It'll just return the state, so the state will remain unchanged. Cool. So there's my reducer. Let me just think if there's anything I'm missing here. I'm going to do one other thing. Usually what you do is you also pass in a property called payload, which is something that might help that particular action complete itself. So in this case, I'm going to assume that action.payload is a number. So I'm going to say plus action.payload minus action.payload. So that way you can not only add and subtract, but you could actually edit how much you're adding and subtracting. Cool. So there's my reducer. Okay. So now we can kick off the data store. And the way you just do this is you're going to do export, because we need to export these things. Const array destructuring. The first thing that's going to get passed in from the function that gets returned is the data store component. So the data store component is a component that is essentially a context provider, and then the useDataStore hook, which is going to be the hook that we use to actually pull this data in any component that we want. And that's going to be equal create data store. And then into the data store, we're going to pass in the initial state and the reducer. And that's it. Okay. So there we go. We've kicked it off. So then going forward, if I need to add anything to my state, I add it here. And then I can, any logic that's going to alter that thing, I'll add it here. But I'm good to go. So now I would just go to app. I'm going to import data store from /ds, and then I'm just going to wrap my h1 here in the data store. Data store. And I don't have to worry about a value prop. All that stuff is taken care of under the hood. Okay, so let's just first see that that's working. So let's run the dev server, npm run dev, because in this particular template, create React Basic, npm run dev runs the dev server. Okay, looks like something I gotta tweak, because we don't even see the hello world. That seems like I didn't close a function of some sort. So let's go back over here to ds, export const. Oh, I didn't close the function. Yes, there we go. Yeah, because when it says like you can only use import or export at the top level, it's implying that you're probably trying to use it in a function. So in that case, I fixed it. Save. There we go. Okay, cool. Create data store is not a function. Oh, that's right. I got to destructure that. My bad. I think. There we go. So just to keep in mind what I just did is that technically there is an object being exported from here, from the useDataStore. So what you need to do is you do need to destructure create data store from the output. So you're going to want to write it like that. Let me just make sure that's the way I wrote it in my previous test. Yeah, okay. So there we go. So now if I go to the components, I see the data store component. I see that it has a reducer, a use of the reducer hook, and there's my state. So my state lives there, okay? Cool. So now let's make another component so you can see how we pull that information in. So I want to make another component called other.js. Okay, so you know the deal. Import React from React const other equals props. Okay, and then I will do export default other. Okay, and then I need to import that useDataStore hook. So I import useDataStore from /ds. Cool. And then what this does, it just basically pulls the information out of the context, which is going to be set to two things. It's going to be set to the state object that we passed in, your initial state object, and your dispatch function. So you have to do it this way. So const data store, and again it's spelled with a lowercase this time because it's a variable name, so it's camel case, and dispatch. That's what comes out of this hook. Use data store. But I don't have to worry about also importing a separate context and passing the context into a function. All that's kind of all under the hood. Okay, and just to confirm that I got the stuff, I will console log data store and dispatch so you can see what got pulled out. Okay, so if I go over here, oh, I never actually mounted the component. So let's go back to app.js, import other from, because it's an export default, so I don't need the destructure, /components / oh no, I'm in the same folder. So /other. And then this will be replaced with, well, I'll just put other on top of it. Other. Save. What does it like? Nothing was returned from render. Oh, I never actually returned any JSX. That would be a thing. Return an we'll say a div. And in that div, there's an h1. And inside that h1 is the count variable. So let's say data store dot count. Okay. There we go. So see, it's at 0 because that's where we left the data store. And see, we're getting the data store, the variable, and we're getting the function. Okay, the dispatch function. So we are getting the two things we need. And again, what the dispatch function is, again, if you're not familiar with use reducer and Redux, the dispatch function is what passes an action to the reducer we defined in here. Okay, so basically all dispatch gets passed is this, and then it passes the action and the current state into this function. That's what it does. So dispatch just takes that action, passes it to your reducer function. Your reducer function returns something, that becomes the new state. So instead of you setting the state like a set state function where you directly set the state, instead you're passing some information to this central function that manages all the state changes. Cool. So use data store. That's all fine and good. So what we want to do is create some buttons to edit the state. So let's create one button. And we're going to give it an onClick method. And I'm just going to write it, the logic right here. It has to be of dispatch. It's a pretty quick write. So I just write an arrow function that's going to invoke the dispatch function. And in the dispatch function, I just pass an object. That object is essentially the action. And again, action we know so far, based on our reducer, should have two types or two properties. Type, which we're going to say is add. So this is going to be the add button. And then it'll have a payload. And in this case, the payload is just one. It'll add one. Okay. And let me see here. Then we need to close the button and then write like add on it. And then we'll make another button. Okay, but see, like, my component looks really clean because all that logic for adding and subtracting is all in that other file. And I can quickly see what is doing what. I just take a look at the type, and I can quickly go to my reducer and just take a look at the switch to find the type that that particular function does. So I can quickly see, okay, when this button is clicked, it's doing this or this. Okay, so basically, again, it just allows you to centralize the logic parts of your components here. Here, there is a cost of encapsulation because your components become so dependent on this store that if you wanted to use that same component in a completely separate project, probably not going to happen. But again, generally, your components that need application level state are going to be application specific components. The components that you plan to be reusable should probably be children of those sort of application specific components and get this data passed as props. So that way those components remain sort of encapsulated, but you still have sort of other places where sort of that become sort of hubs of distributing your application state in your component tree. Cool. Now this should be working now. So let's go back over here. So see, I have two buttons, although they both say add. So let's fix that. Subtract. So whenever I hit this button, it should add, and that's what it does. And whenever I hit this button, it should subtract because it's just running, passing that action into the reducer. So again, this object gets passed into the reducer. Okay. The reducer checks the action type, which was add, if I click on the add button. So what it does, it returns an object with all the other state properties if there were other state properties, but count is then added by the amount of the payload, which was 1 in our case. So yeah, so see, that was pretty quick setup. I mean, we did this in, well, 17 minutes, but I mean, if you ever set up Redux or decide to do useStore and useContext on your own, it does take significantly more time to set it up. And then again, this could have been a lot faster if I wasn't explaining every step of the way. So this just is a simple little tool to really help set up application level state really quick. So that way you have it, you can use it without introducing you like a huge library. It's just a quick function that just helps automate many of the steps you would normally take with useContext and useReducer, give you the two pieces you need, the hook to pull the stuff out of the context provider, and the context provider to provide the context. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.